versus Reid Mason.
Good morning, Mr. Clerk. If you could vote on the gentleman's behalf, may we approach the Senate Council today?
And who'll be representing the Barnstable Police Department?
Lieutenant Green.
I'll have a seat. Good morning, everyone. Mr. Mason, my name is Keith McDonough. I'm the Clerk Magistrate of Lawrence District Court. I'm going to be the person conducting the show cause hearing today. Mr. Mason, it's alleged that on February 28th of the year 2022 in the town of Barnstable that you improperly stored 5 firearms. So at this point, I'm going to hear testimony from the Commonwealth, and Lieutenant Green, is that going to be you presenting that evidence?
Yes, it is.
Okay. At the conclusion of Lieutenant Green's testimony, I'm going to give you and your attorney, Mr. Lloyd, the opportunity to ask any questions of the officer. Next, you'll have the opportunity to testify if you so choose, but I must advise you that this proceeding is being recorded, and anything that you say could potentially be used against you at a later date. You also have the right to say nothing, and there will be no negative inference drawn against you for remaining silent. If you do choose to testify, Lieutenant Green will have the opportunity to ask you any questions. I want you to understand that my role today here is to determine whether or not there's probable cause to issue criminal complaints against you. If you have any questions. Lieutenant? And I'm sorry, raise your right hand if you would. Is your client going to testify?
I don't think so, Mr. Clerk.
Raise your right hand. Solemnly swear the testimony about to give in the class on hearing, be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
That's it, Lieutenant.
Good afternoon, Mr. Magistrate. I'm going to be reading from a report from Officer Rogozinski, Barnstable Police Patrol Officer. The report reads, on February 28th of 2022, he was in a plainclothes assignment with another officer in unmarked cruiser. At approximately 12:15 a.m., while performing a security check at 11 Barnstable Road, the 19th Hole Tavern parking lot, he observed a black Jeep Wrangler parked in the parking lot. The vehicle was turned off, and he observed a male later identified as Reid Mason, date of birth 11/26 of 99, slumped over the driver's side, partially hanging out of the driver's side door. In fear that the male was in need of medical attention, the officers checked on his well-being. As the officers made contact with Mason, he was extremely disoriented. He stated he did not need any medical attention, and he was just sleeping inside of his vehicle. While speaking with Mason, the officers were overwhelmed by a strong odor of alcoholic beverage emanating from his person. His eyes were red and glassy, and he had a difficult time answering questions. At this point, the officers observed what appeared to be 2 different firearms located on the passenger seat next to Mason. Mason was then escorted out of the vehicle due to the officers' observations. Once Mason exited, the officers located 5 total firearms in the front right passenger seat area. Additionally, they located an assortment of cases of ammunition inside of 2 backpacks. Mason was able to obtain a ride home from a family member. Mason was advised that all firearms and ammunition located on this date had been seized, and his license to carry was now suspended. All the firearms and ammunition were transported back to the Barnstable Police. They were documented and secured. Mason's license to carry was seized and entered into evidence. All of the firearms at the time of the officers' interaction with Mason were unloaded. At no point were there any rounds in the chamber or magazines seated inside the firearm. The officer goes on to state that based on his observations of Mason's sobriety, he believes that he lost the ability to exercise control over the firearms located inside the vehicle. Mason's level of intoxication compromised his ability to immediately reach the firearms, and it satisfies the charge of improper storage of the firearm. A copy of this report was forwarded to the District Attorney's Office to review his interpretation of intoxication and its influence on intoxication as it applies to the improper storage statute. After review, the Barnstable County District Attorney's Office recommended that the case should proceed to a magistrate's hearing. Those are essentially the facts.
Thank you, Lieutenant. Mr. Lloyd, any questions of Lieutenant Green?
Please. Lieutenant, it's your function and responsibility to represent the department over here at the courthouse.
Yes, it is.
Fair to say that back on February 28th, at this early morning hours, you were not working or part of the investigation that took place on scene?
Correct.
Okay. But you review the reports and submit applications to the court and conduct these type of hearings?
Correct. I have the officer involved he's here. I'm not calling as a witness right now. But if there's any further questions on, for that officer, I have him here. He's ready to give testimony.
Okay. Fair to say when the application was filled out, there's a spot to note whether or not the accused has a prior criminal record, right?
Correct.
And he does not, correct?
Correct.
Consistent with the fact that he was issued a license to carry by the town, correct?
That's correct.
And at the time that this event was taking place and investigated, that was a proper license and in place, no suspensions, no issues, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. The two officers that responded, they're in plain clothes, right?
That's correct.
And they're somewhat new officers. In other words, they were sworn in around 2019, so they have about 3 years of experience, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And there wasn't a call to go to this particular location. As part of sort of their plainclothes responsibilities, they patrol businesses and parking lots around town just to keep order, right? Fair?
Yes.
Okay. And they happen to come across this vehicle. No one points it out to them. They simply notice this, right?
Correct. Based on his report here, they observed.
His position at the driver's side door, right?
Correct.
Okay. So they go over, and one of the things that they note is they're wondering whether it's a medical issue or a well-being attention, right?
Correct.
Okay. And despite the fact that they, at some point, write that he appears to be disoriented, they ask him whether or not he needs medical attention, right?
Yes, they did.
And it certainly appears that they accept his answer that he does not, correct?
Correct.
So no rescue was ever called, no one from the fire or paramedic come out and take a look at him?
They did not.
Okay. They ask him what he was doing, and essentially he says he was sleeping in his vehicle.
Correct.
All right. There isn't any statements in the report that you're aware of, Lieutenant, that they asked him about where he was or what he was doing prior to sleeping in his vehicle, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And ultimately, they don't even ask him any questions about alcohol consumption, as far as you can tell from the report, right?
Just notes that they smelled a strong odor of alcohol.
Sure.
They gave some things here of his answer to questions were a little bit, looks like he had a difficult time answering questions. His eyes were bloodshot and glassy.
Okay. It's fair to say that they don't articulate out what those questions were or what his presumable answers were to those, right?
Correct.
Okay. And then the other things are physical observations that they make of him, his eyes, and then what they smell.
Correct.
All right. But he had said he was sleeping, right?
He did.
Okay. Sergeant, you agree with me that someone's eyes can be red and glassy for things other than alcohol consumption, right?
Correct.
All right. And an odor of alcohol simply means that someone may have consumed some alcohol, correct?
Correct.
All right. There is a protective custody policy in Barnstable, right?
Correct.
Okay. And that's something that talks about alcohol, but it also brings an officer's attention to there are other reasons other than alcohol why someone may need some assistance from the police or perhaps rescue, right?
Correct.
Okay. And they certainly could make a decision to have rescue check him out to see whether it's a health issue or whether it's alcohol going on, right?
Based on the report from the officers, it looks like they came to the determination that alcohol was the contributing factor.
Sure, but the policy talks about that you could have him checked out, right?
If the officers suspected that there was something else going on other than alcohol consumption, then that's a measure that they would take.
Okay. And the policy also talks about having someone do reasonable tests of coordination to determine whether alcohol is involved, right?
The officers can conduct those tests. It's not something that they have to do.
It's a policy, right?
Correct.
Okay. And certainly from what you read in the report and what you know, it doesn't appear that the officers ask him to do any of those reasonable tests of coordination, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And when they're talking to him, he is cooperative with them?
He is.
I mean, the only three statements really are that he doesn't need medical attention, that he was sleeping in the car, and then something about they say that he had difficulty answering questions. But again, that's not laid out in the report, right?
The questions themselves are not laid out in the report. His state that he was in when he was speaking with the officers is in there, and then when it comes back and it talks about the officer's opinion of sobriety
Sure.
and his ability to exercise control of firearms, I think it was an indicator of what their thoughts was of his sobriety at that point.
Okay. So when they first encounter him, he's in that position of at the driver's side, as they say, slumped over and partially out the door, right?
Correct.
Okay. But he seems to respond to them when they appear, correct?
Correct.
All right. The first weapons that the officer noted are two that are on the passenger seat, right?
Correct.
Is there anything in the report about how many doors that Jeep has?
It does not say.
Is there anything in the report about whether or not my client's wearing a seatbelt?
It does not say that, no.
Does it say anything about whether the doors on the passenger side are locked?
It does not.
Okay. And then it sort of generally speaks of the position of the other weapons in the car that are in the area of the front passenger seat, right?
Correct.
But certainly from what you understand, Lieutenant, they're all within close proximity of where he is in the driver's seat.
Correct.
And there's a note of some backpacks that are in the vehicle as well, but again, in the close proximity of where he is, right?
Correct. It all says that it's all located in the same area.
Okay. And then after sort of discerning that what is present, he is advised that his license to carry is suspended and everything was going to be seized and taken and accounted for, right?
Correct.
Okay. And that status has not changed. I mean, his license is under suspension, fair?
It is under suspension. Yes,
Okay.
correct.
And certainly in part because of this investigation and the possible charges and the outcome of those charges.
Correct.
And all of the weapons, none of them had any rounds in the chamber and there were no magazines in them, correct?
Correct.
They don't ask him any questions about the firearms that are recorded or reported in this report, right?
The only thing that I have is that the officers responded to his residence on March 2nd, and they received the additional firearm that wasn't accounted for that was registered to Mr. Reid.
Okay, so that's 4 days later, and that's a result of his license going into suspension. Officers wanted to sort of take care of housekeeping and get the last weapon, right?
Correct.
And that was done, correct?
Yes, it was.
Okay, and without issue, Lieutenant, right?
Correct.
Okay. I don't have any other questions for the lieutenant. Obviously, at the appropriate time, I'd like to make a statement and be heard.
Any further evidence that you'd like to present, Mr. Lloyd?
I'm not going to have my client testify, Mr. Clerk, but I'd provide some background on him to you. Thank you. The gentleman's date of birth, as the lieutenant indicated, is November 26, 1999. He was born in Michigan, but he has resided in Massachusetts essentially his entire life outside of 1 year that he was away at school. He lives in West Barnstable. He's lived in the same house for the past 22 years. He's a product of the Barnstable school system. He went to Barnstable Public Schools. He did attend the 8th grade outside of Massachusetts and Arizona, but he came back and graduated from Barnstable High School in 2018. He then went on to put himself into 4Cs in the EMT program, which he graduated also in 2018, and is a student, or actually he's finishing up at Massasoit Community College, where he's in the paramedic program. He has finished all of the coursework towards getting a paramedic's license, but there is some follow-up and ride time that he needs to account for to move forward. He has been employed in the EMS industry, in the fire industry since March of 2019. He works for a third-party business down on the Lower Cape, and most recently has worked for a local department down there since October of 2021. I would indicate that he has been suspended and suspended without pay based upon the fact that this investigation is out there and their concerns about his ability to perform his functions and actually have a driver's license and the like. So that's the background I'd like to provide to you, but then I would like to address with you the application, the elements, and what I think the relevant case law is, Mr. Clerk. And I did take the opportunity, because as I kind of focused on this and looked at it, this is not a situation or a question of possession. It's a situation and question of control. And it is distinguishable, and the case law talks about that it is distinguishable. So when we talk about the improper storage of a firearms and what that statute means, first of all, the government has to produce and present some information to you, even at a probable cause standard, that these are in fact firearms. And I would suggest, Mr. Clerk, you've heard sort of a general conclusion that they're firearms, but the statute talks about a lot more, that they have a particular barrel length, that they are capable of discharging a shot or a bullet, and respectfully to the lieutenant and to the application process and what's been presented, I haven't heard anything that covers that. But then the statute goes on to address those situations when what improper means when something is stored, and distinguishing that from when somebody is carrying a weapon, which is not what I'm suggesting here, or that situation where it is under his immediate control. And I know this is where the police have talked a little bit about control, and the report references the word control at the end. And these case laws talk about what controlled means. And it certainly, again, distinguishes from physical possession to control. And why I asked the questions about where he was seated so particularly, why I asked the questions about where they are found, is the analysis that these cases get into, that it's so important that for someone in Mr. Mason's position to make the argument that he's in control of these is that he is close to them. They're not down the hall, they're not in his jacket upstairs, as some of these cases talk about, but they're actually in a vehicle that he's in the driver's seat, that there are two right next to him, and the others are in the area of that or right in front of the passenger seat. So proximity-wise and the analysis that the case talks about, he's right there. So he meets the first part of what the court has discussed or talked about in regards to control. And the court says, you know, control isn't specifically addressed in the statute, but these are the factors that I think we should look at. He is the owner and or the authorized person to have them. The police don't and can't tell you how many doors there are in the Jeep, whether the other side is locked, but I would suggest that he's in control of them. He's right there. They ask him some questions and he begins to respond. He tells them he was sleeping. They say he was disoriented, but yet they're willing to accept his statement that he doesn't need any medical attention. So the officers write and talk about, at first they're thinking it's a medical situation or maybe a well-being situation, and the lieutenant certainly acknowledges that, you know, they can call rescue if they think they need it, and they choose not to because they're satisfied that he makes a statement that he doesn't need it and he doesn't require it. And I would suggest that that evidences that he is immediately in control of what's going on in the situation. Thereafter, the police conclude that they think he's disoriented because of alcohol, and that's why this application is in front of you, but yet they don't really examine that any further. They don't ask him any questions about alcohol consumption, where he'd been, what he'd been doing, how long he'd been there. Their policy certainly talks about allowing or having someone do reasonable tests of coordination. None of those are offered to him. They don't do that. They don't certainly take him into protective custody. They allow him to leave the scene. And then we're sort of in this situation without any further information. So I would suggest respectfully, Mr. Clerk, that there is insufficient probable cause to suggest that he was not in control of what was in his own vehicle as he was seated there and the police came upon him. And I'd ask you that you deny the application. If you find otherwise, I'd ask to be heard in regards to how you wish to proceed.
Okay. I'm going to take a recess. I'm going to read your proposed case law, and then I'll be back as soon as I'm done.
Thank you.
be seated.
So, Mr. Lloyd, I had the opportunity to read the cases that you cited. Based on the testimony that I've heard today, my finding is that there is probable cause to issue a complaint. You said you'd like to be heard. I'll give you that opportunity.
Thank you. As I understand the proceedings that we're addressing, there are not rules, but there are procedures that you can consider. And one of the things that I believe that you can consider under the appropriate circumstances, and that I believe you must ask the applicant, is that the application can be deferred, and that's what I'm going to ask you to do. Obviously, in my statement, I was somewhat suggesting that I thought you may arrive at this. I think it's good that we had a public hearing and allowed the information to come out and everybody to hear what information is there, what's in the report, and obviously you had an opportunity to hear that yourself. The gentleman has absolutely no record. It's in the application it shows it, the fact that he had a license shows it, and the license is now presently under suspension. I think it's highly unlikely that any licensing authority, including the Barnstable Police Department, would reissue him a license based upon the situation that's being presented to you and what's being considered. But I'd ask that you defer the application, leave it open for a period of time, that you assess, whether that be 6 months or perhaps even a year. Allow him to show that he's a law-abiding citizen without any issues, without any concerns, and if that time frame goes by without concern, that the application be addressed at that point.
Very good. And I'm aware that I do have the option of deferring my decision on that complaint, but at this point I'm going to make a finding of probable cause, and the complaint, sir, will issue against you. You'll receive a summons to appear on a later date for an arraignment.